Well, let me first mention that I very much appreciated this presentation of the real hot political debate that Minister Linkevičius reflected, and I'm really glad that I could see in his approach the same old passion that I knew from the NAC, Linas. So what I want to bring is to come back to a bit of a, I would say, more analytical perspective, maybe also because the strategic analysis capabilities is hosted in my division, and try to present how we want to make sense of this context in order to bring political masters the options for political decisions. And you asked, yes, I think we're doing a lot, but I think there's a lot more to do, and it's a work in progress, to be very honest. The division that I'm heading is called Emerging Security Challenges, and I have to tell you that, and it's linked with what Linas was mentioning. In the past, there were two lines of thought. Some who said, well, why do we need this new challenges division, and the ideas of the mandate in energy security, cyber, or even counterterrorism, which are all under this division, were under question. Others would say, well, actually, this is the future, because we won't need to handle the old types of threats. We were debating the new strategic concept. There was the discussion, well, maybe we won't need to worry so much about territorial defense, because the political context is changing in the 21st century, and so on. And look where we are. If you would ask me to describe the international security environment in one sentence, I would say it's a combination of emerging security challenges and re-emerging one. And they're kind of blending together in such a way that they're creating a huge level of complexity. And we need to make sense of this environment, because we have both. We have a high level of these new challenges blended, well, the old types of threats, and we see a breach of sovereignty and territorial integrity, and so on. Now, coming to hybrid warfare, I want to make first bring some elements of descriptions, because there are still no clear definitions, but there are good descriptions, I would say, both in the political debate and in the academic debate. I want to make a point that we should see this phenomenon from a strategic dimension rather than a tactical way of using military or non-military or conventional or non-conventional aspects, and then in the end make a couple of points of one important, very new dimension, which is the cyber dimension. I'm sure you will like it, because you're doing this stuff in Estonia. When it comes to asking what we're talking about, again, let me mention a couple of descriptions that I think are relevant. I think we could say that it's the hybrid warfare involves the coordinated, overt and covert use of a broad range of instruments, military, civilian, conventional or unconventional, in an ambiguous attack on another state. I think it's also important to mention that it always is linked to assuring a certain level of deniability and ambiguity. But I should also quote the fact that this description, which you can find mainly among Western analysts, has to be also put into perspective with what I would say the Russian approach is. Now, there's no talk about this concept of hybrid warfare in the Russian approach, but I should recall that For example, in February 2013, the Russian Chief of Staff, General Gerasimov, mentioned in one of his public addresses that war and peace are becoming more blurred. Methods of conflicts have changed and now involved the broad use of political, economic, informational, humanitarian, and other non-military measures. And all of this, as we can see, can be supplementing with some firing up of local populations through propaganda, and the examples that Minister Linkevičius has put forward were extremely well targeted. It's also noted by General Gerasimov that mobilization does not occur only after the war, but and this is, I think, mentioned also by a link to some Soviet military theoretician, I'm told, Mr. Isserson. Mobilization does not occur only after the war, it precedes long before that. And you can see that these descriptions very much resemble some realities. And you're right, hybrid warfare is not necessarily a new phenomenon. It happened a long time in history. It happened also in this part of the world, starting with Transnistria in the 90s, and then Georgia, and of course what happened more recently in Crimea and eastern Ukraine has been developing a bigger scale and also a bigger sense of complexity. But it's something that it's worth considering. And let me come to the main point, why it's worth considering having a strategic dimension, not just these aspects of tactical dimension. I think more and more analysts start to see this tight pole-mill relationship. And I saw another description that I found extremely interesting, that hybrid warfare has a purpose indeed of keeping an adversary politically, military, societally off balance. How? Through denial of and defection from standard norms and principles of international relations in pursuit of some focused interest. Why my point is that we should see it as an element of strategic dimension, because it occurs in a shifting strategic environment. This is first. Secondly, it does disrupt strategic international balance and international order, and it's visible. The fact that it's designed in such a way that it generates actions under the cover of deniability and below the threshold of a meaningful response of the international community, I would say that it also disturbs the functioning of the international balance, including the functioning of deterrence, because this is based on the fact that the deterrence element, that any players, international or international actors, are discouraged of making wrong moves due to the risk of response, of meaning of response. In this case, this method actually gives the possibility to act for focused interest below these thresholds. There's another element that is important to have in mind. We can see that hybrid warfare methods usually are backed with a threat of massive military force, conventional force, and sometimes even by the use of nuclear capabilities. And these have indeed strategic dimensions. So all these aspects show us that the subject needs to be addressed with all its components. It doesn't have just a response to it should not just focus on a response to a new tactical set of tools that somebody could employ and try to respond with the same set of tools. It has to be seen from the bigger perspective. I would also argue that the scale of the employment of these new non-conventional tools is much bigger than any time we could see in the past. The complexity of their blending, and also there are a couple of elements and components that have also a high degree of novelty, like the cyber dimension. Now, cyber dimension in warfare is quite new. The first observation of using cyber methods was during the 2008 August War in Georgia, and we have seen this kind of use as a much bigger scale in the case of the Ukraine crisis. And it's an interesting blend between cyber and information warfare. Because these two strands have to be understood as follows. Cyberspace has become a domain of competition and warfare, but there's one thing to use information warfare that means to take advantage of the fast, the opportunity of a fast move of information through the use of different channels, social media, and so on and so forth, in a way that doesn't imply disrupting the infrastructure. And there's another way that implies the disruption of the infrastructure, either the software or the hardware or both. So this level of complexity needs a certain level, the same kind of level of complexity of response. I would end by mentioning that NATO has a mandate from heads of states and governments from the Wales Summit in last year, in September 2014, to address this concept of hybrid warfare. We are developing, I would say, comprehensive analysis, which will be addressed by ministers later this year at the Defense Ministerial, and afterwards subsequent comprehensive strategy that will be presented to the next summit, which will take place in Warsaw. This is linked with a big mandate of NATO's adaptation. It is linked with the readiness action plan. It is linked to our aim of adapting this alliance to the reality of the world we're living in. And I will stop here. I would be available for questions.